I realized early in life that the less social and economic capital you have, the more you are excluded and made to feel your exclusion. I would go on to learn that historically, laws play a role in the oppression as well. My talk today is for the thousands and as yet unnamed individuals that traverse the waters of the Atlantic in the bows of the ships, and their descendants that survived and went on to live in lands that deny their humanity. Because its spaces were places where large numbers of enslaved Africans were brought forcibly to labor, I decided to evaluate how their and their descendants' lives are presented at nationally significant former plantations that are currently owned and managed by the federal government. Even though I consider plantations the reservoir of the transatlantic slave trade, the quarter is the space where they loved, willingly procreated, despaired, died, thrived, sustained, and created cultural traditions. It did not take long in the process of evaluating federal sites to realize that interpretation was significantly hampered by the availability of financial resources. At that point, I added economically thriving plantation sites that were once home to former presidents George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson. In total, I evaluated 8 plantations. The Booker T. Washington National Monument in Pawnee, Virginia. The George Washington Mount Vernon in Arlington, Virginia. Yes, James Madison Montpelier in Orange, Virginia. Kingsley Plantation in Jacksonville, Florida. Hampton National Historic Site in Townsend, Maryland. Natchez National Historic Park in Natchez, Mississippi. I don't feel so bad. Okay, yes, okay. So Thomas Jefferson's Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia. And the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site in just outside of St. Louis, Missouri. Okay. Nobody wants to be descendants of enslaved individuals. And if you are, customarily one wants to be associated with those that fought, fled north or south of Mexico in search of freedom. How often has the quote, "freed 1,000 slaves, I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves," been used to suggest that those who did not run away or fight possessed a certain Uncle Tom's persona, if you will. For my research, I made the decision to view those that dared to create, to love, to remain on the plantation, to run away, to kill themselves or their enslaver, as equally exhibiting unbound behavior, for all paid dearly to maintain a degree of personal liberty. I consider all of these acts indicators of hope. If they remained on the plantation, loved and had children, they could not protect themselves or their children from the ravages of enslavement. They and their children were subject to being bought, sold, bequeathed, inherited, mortgaged, seized for debts, whipped, humiliated, killed, any or all of the above. They risked heartache from separation for those they knew and loved. In the case of males and females, an individual could be forced to breed and add human assets and product inventory to the financial and social balance sheet of the enslaver. They had to adapt to living with no civil or political rights. They could not marry, own property, sue, testify against a white man, make contracts, vote, hold political office, or become citizens. In all the parts, I wanted to know whether the historical narrative included the stories of enslaved persons, and if so, from whose perspective. I wanted to know whether the aesthetics in their cultural landscape, traditions, folkways, and elements of their material culture preserved and presented. I also was looking for evidence of an overlapping story. More often than not, what I heard and saw were stories of 6 or so enslaved individuals, always in relationship to their work, directly benefiting the enslaver. As to the ideas, creations, the thoughts, connection to the spirit and natural resources of the hundreds beyond the white coromanches and magnolias, I was left wondering. Intentionally or not, most sites were bereft of the community that once was the enslaved. What did the findings mean? Does it mean that the spiritual and compositional elements of beauty, order, form, color, design, did not exist in the quarters and the spaces and places where thousands of enslaved individuals lived? Did it mean that hope and creativity did not exist in that cultural milieu? For beauty to exist, it must be valued and appreciated. If in a creation, first and foremost by the Creator, and from there, the world in which the Creator lives. While we deny and ignore its attractability and the history, I propose the findings are nuanced expressions of the psychosocial dynamics and racial ideologies, attitudes, and social, cultural, social class structure of the transatlantic slave trade. Consciously and subconsciously, the legacy of slavery reaches into and affects the aesthetics, thoughts, and actions of descendants of those enslaved, as well as those that enslaved. The experience reinforced my earlier observation that those with less social, economic, and political capital are excluded and made to feel their exclusion. I want to share with you a couple of examples of unbound behavior that I referenced earlier and beauty within the context of bondage. When I thought about the times and the actions of lovers in this first example, I realized the only place for them to run was uncharted wilderness, where their survival depended on the kindness of indigenous people, or in not dying from animal attack or being killed by the ravages of slavery, the ravages of nature. This is from the Boston Evening Post, August 12, 1746. Quote, last Thursday evening, August 11, 1746, a very surprising tragedy was acted here in the following manner. A Negro fellow at the north end and a Negro woman belonging to a gentleman at the south end of the town, having contracted an intimate and strict friendship together, and understanding that the rent was about to be sold into the country, they resolved to put an end to their lives rather than be parted. And accordingly, about 7 o'clock, the rent being at the house of her countryman, they went upstairs into the garret, where the fellow, as is supposed, cut the renter's throat with a razor, and with the gun prepared for the purpose, shot himself. They were both found lying on the bed. September 19, 1858. My dear wife, I take the pleasure of writing you these few with much regret to inform you that I am sold to a man by the name of Peterson, a trader, and stays in New Orleans. I am here yet, but I expect to go before long. But when I get there, I will write and let you know where I am. My dear, I want to send you some things, but I do not know who to send them by, but I will try to get them to you and my children. Give my love to my father and mother, and tell them goodbye for me. And if we shall not meet in this world, I hope to meet in heaven. My dear wife, for you and my children, my pen cannot express the grief I feel to be parted from you all. I remain your truly husband until death, Abram Scriven to his wife, Donna Jones. The next slides are images of crafts that were created by enslaved Africans and their descendants during or post-slavery. This basket was made, actually, it was made by a friend of mine who is a sweetgrass basket weaver down in South Carolina. His family are descendants of the enslaved from South Carolina. His making it is actually in the tradition because the baskets were initially woven by men. And the original basket that was used was the family basket, which I have an image of. This was made in the tradition of enslaved lunchbox that was used by enslaved people. These are ruins of the quarters at Kingsley Plantation. There were 25 plantation houses. They were made, they were created in a crescent. Supposedly, it's thought to be as if it were an African village. The owner of this plantation, actually, I should say, the mistress of the owner of this plantation was from Senegal. He bought her and in Cuba. She went from Senegal to Cuba, and he bought her when she was in Cuba and brought her to the U.S. It was Spanish, Florida was Spanish owned at the time, and or a Spanish colony, I should say. And he set her up in her. She actually had her own plantation, which was separate from his. This was his primary plantation. What happened when the war between Spain and America and Florida essentially became a British colony and came under British rule, she had allowed them, the Spanish, to use her plantation. So it was ruined. So she came to live on this plantation. And if you can see the entire thing, which you can't on this picture, but it suggests it's in a crescent. Again, supposedly considered to be similar to what you would find in a village in Senegal. This cooking pot, Whitney Plantation, wasn't one of the plantations that I visited to that was part of the research. Or I added it afterwards because of all of the plantations that I have seen interpreted, they do the best job. It came online just as I was finishing my thesis, and I added it as and maybe you've seen it on the news. It is a fantastically research. I mean, if you're going to do a plantation, you do it like this guy's done. He spent. He had a researcher who is a professor from. I think he's actually from Senegal, who did all the research, and they actually had documented all the slaves that were ever on the plantation with names and many of the places in which they came from Africa. And this was one of the cooking pots that was used by the enslaved there. These leg shackles, in 2005, I had created I was doing a festival, and I had an exhibit called Enslaved in the Americas. And these were some shackles that we had in a display. And these were created, these now are all, that collar that I showed you, these are all now in the art collection of individuals. The sad thing about the shackles, I actually included them in that exhibit, and I included them in another exhibit because they were created by an enslaved person. And I just, the irony of creating something, and some of the ones that this particular ironwork person did, they're beautiful, absolutely beautiful, but and this is a quilt, again, it was from South Carolina, and it was done in the early 1800s. And this is the Faneuil basket, and that was the basket that would have been used by enslaved in rice areas where they would use it to whittle rice. They would just throw the rice up. Now they are collector's items. These two are made by men, and that's really is in the tradition. And one of the reasons that the sweetgrass was added later on, but initially they were made with that red material, which is called bulrush, and men would use it and make it because the bulrush is just very hard. It's a very tough material to work with. But I added them here because they are things of beauty. In Uncomfortable Truth and Hushed Silence, I presented guidelines for comprehensive interpretation and colonial and antebellum period plantations that address the issues of social injustice in interpretation that I witnessed, to remind visitors that people were enslaved and to provide and maintain someone's lifestyle. I recommend that the following passage currently used in the quarters of Melrose Plantation be used instead in Big House, all plantations. Quote, Rachel, Marcellus, Charles, William, Mamie, and others were part of the day-to-day life at Melrose. These men, women, and children performed every task needed to serve the Vernon family. Rachel cooked the meals, the family meals. Marcellus pushed the dumbwaiter loaded with food and drink into the dining room and served the meals. Charles drove the carriage that took his master and mistress to town or to visit neighbors. William hauled everything from food purchased in town to a visiting relative's luggage. Mamie expertly canned and preserved vegetable and fruit. Others cleaned the main house, loaded and unloaded supplies, weeded gardens, maintained the sprawling yard, and cared for the livestock. For graduation, I was given the book, The Death of Prehistory. As yet I haven't read it, but it questions the pretext of civilization beginning with written history. It is this type of critical examination that I propose for an interpretive practitioner in all industry, but particularly those in the fields of historic preservation, public history, and history in general. To educate and present for the now, I suggest the use of technology and cultural art, such as the animated GIF created by Vivi.com of the built history of Faneuil Hall site, but add with it the social context of the time. I couldn't put it in, but if you can see it, if you go to their site, it's a wonderful kind of progression in time, and it goes through the built history of Faneuil Hall. Interestingly enough, I was kind of glad that they used Faneuil Hall, because what is not talked about in the mention of Faneuil Hall is that there's enslaved history associated with Faneuil Hall. And so I thought it would be theirs doesn't with any social environment. All you see is the different frames and this kind of thing. But this would be one of the kind of things that I would suggest to a plantation or a site that was interpreting something and it has slavery involved, or any social context, to the social context of the time, so that you get an idea of what it was that was going on. Next slide, please. Or the life-size ceramic. These were children that were created by this wonderful ceramic artist. I actually have one of his pieces. And when he initially started creating these life-size children for that plantation, I saw his kilns and I saw some of his prototype. But again, this is some of the kinds of things that I put in my guidelines to suggest that plantations would use. And again, this came on just as I was finished. I was like, man! Anyway. As a need for research to identify enslaved persons, their roots is great. I propose paid internships and fellowships, as well as linkages with colleges and universities. While it was clear that increasing funding was needed, it was also clear that practitioners must recognize their role in perpetuating and sustaining the dominant culture. Next slide. Touching collars, arms and leg shackles, reading wills, I have gone from a position of benign denial and feeling ashamed to accepting that all evidence indicates that I am a descendant of one or more of the estimated 500,000 to just under 1 million Africans brought forcibly to America between 1619 and 1808. While I've always loved the rhythms of my Black experience, a few years ago, I'm not sure I would comfortably say that. But with knowledge and understanding and acceptance and appreciation of ordinary people that live with grace and dignity and beauty in the face of social injustice.